I am excited about this next presentation. Lizzie is going to be talking about migrating applications to .NET Core. Lizzie, so you're a developer at MasterCard and you've worked on this sort of stuff at scale, right?
Yeah, definitely. So this has kind of been my main project that me and my team have worked on for the last 2 years.
Wow. So this is real world stuff. So I'm really excited to see it. Take it away.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks so much. All right, so hello, .NET Conf. So as shared, my name is Lizzie Gallagher, and I work at MasterCard. For the last 2 years, I've had the joy of co-leading our effort to migrate a large number of our applications to .NET Core. So today, I'm really just going to tell you a story. It's a story of some of the highs and lows of this migration effort. It's going to be a story of some of the decisions that we made, both the good ones and the bad ones. Now, I'm going to tell the story at a fairly high level, kind of give you an overview of the playbook that my team followed for this migration. So if you're watching this and you're exploring doing a similar migration for your company, I don't expect this talk to provide you like a precise map to your destination. But I do hope that hearing our story and the questions that we asked and the ways we answered them will help you anticipate those questions and the challenges that lie ahead. Before I begin, one caveat. This talk completely skips over evaluating whether .NET Core is, quote, worth the effort of migration for your company. I won't lie, this migration did take a lot of effort, especially at the scale that we are working at. And even in the best of possible cases, .NET Core, the migration, getting there can be fairly disruptive. So it's a caveat, we're not going to be answering that question. But with that aside, are you guys ready for some .NET Core? All right, let's go. So 2 years ago, my team, there are 5 of us, 5 developers, we wrote down our goal, which was to migrate all applications in our platform to .NET Core. Now, let me provide you some context by what I mean by our platform. This is an artistic rendering of our platform. It is a web of .NET microservices with 160 web applications, 90 console applications, and 300 internal NuGet packages. I don't know who you are. I don't know whether these numbers strike you as small or unbelievably large. But I do know that I personally felt a sense of dread when we first pulled these numbers and starting out on the migration. This many applications seemed entirely out of scope for my 5-person team to migrate all ourselves. So we immediately started by trimming our aspirations because we didn't want to have to abort the mission immediately. So if our original goal was to migrate all applications, our revised goal was, what if we just migrated those that are actively developed? Because one thing that my company has and your company has and all companies have in common is that we have legacy code, applications that have chugged along happily for many years with little intervention. So little intervention that no one maybe quite remembers the last time anyone made a meaningful change to the code. And so by having our team narrow our focus to just actively developed applications, we ensured that there would always be what I'm going to call application experts. Now, you may have another name for this kind of person, maybe a product team or members of a development domain. What I mean when I say application experts is a group of technical folks who know an application well enough to confidently make changes. Application experts are those who feel ownership over an application and responsibility for its health and stability. Let's jump back to our platform. As I said, ours is a microservices architecture. So one product is made up of multiple applications, maybe a few large applications, maybe a few small applications. And maybe these products also share foundational services like the application for authenticating users. And within each of these little squares, you have application experts who feel ownership over that set of applications. Okay, so we have narrowed our problem space to just actively developed applications. So our next question to answer was who should do the migration? I.e., who should make the code changes? Who should do the research about what CI/CD changes need to be made? Who should troubleshoot if things don't go as planned? Now, a natural candidate here would be the migration expert. Remember, my team was given near full allocation to this project. And although we know very little about these applications that we wanted to migrate, we would have the time and singular focus to gain deep knowledge about .NET Core and how to migrate to it. However, I cannot stress enough that we did not have context on these applications. Yes, all of our applications did have a rich suite of tests, to validate that behavior worked, but we just couldn't shake the nagging feeling that if we were to take this all on ourselves, it could not be the most efficient use of time, nor the safest course of action to have my team make deep fundamental changes to code bases we had never seen before. Okay, so then who should do the migration? What about those application experts I just told you about? Remember, I told you about them, those who feel ownership over an application and intimately know the code base? Well, they do have a lot of other things on their plate, namely shipping features to our clients, but they do have deep knowledge about how their applications work. Surely they must be more capable of making a fundamental change like migrating to .NET Core. However, we quickly realized that asking all product teams to do this migration would require so many engineers to spend the time to gain expertise in specifically the .NET Core migration. Not only would they never need this expertise again, but everybody would be doing this research in parallel and couldn't benefit from lessons that others had learned. And so 2 years ago, when we were pondering this question before we began, we wondered, okay, so how can we leverage the deep knowledge of our application experts about their applications, but also get the efficiency of having a dedicated team coordinating the effort? So we ultimately landed on a hybrid solution, sharing the responsibility between the migration and application experts. So my team signed up to do the legwork of the migration, doing all the upfront research, automating the migration, and being hands-on to troubleshoot. And once our work was done, we would provide step-by-step instructions on the automating script to our application experts. They would then schedule the migration around their existing feature work, run the scripts, and then validate that things worked after they made the changes. If you're watching this talk and you're planning a .NET Core migration or .NET 5 migration for your own company, and you're looking for a key takeaway from this talk, this is it. Making the migration a partnership between those that own the code and those with the know-how from research about the .NET Core migration was one of the keys that made all of this possible, that sort of split ownership. Because having dedicated migration experts gets you a lot of bang for your buck, because there are a lot of similarities between one .NET application and the next. But even though they're very similar, there are differences. And so it's really great to have these application experts being able to close the gap and being able to go that last mile of the things that aren't necessarily standard. All right, so after we decided on this hybrid system of responsibility, we again edited our goal. So if our goal was previously to migrate all actively developed applications in our platform to .NET Core, we changed it to empowering product teams to do the same. So we did have one last decision to make. Should we break this migration into multiple steps, or should we do it all in one go? Well, answering this question ended up being very simple. At the scale that we were working with, especially with as large of an internal NuGet ecosystem as we have, remember we have 300 internal packages, it was not feasible to do this migration all at once. When I say all at once, what do I mean? I mean updating your web framework from ASP.NET to ASP.NET Core. I mean updating all your NuGet dependencies to be .NET Standard compatible. I mean updating your target framework to .NET Core. And I also mean updating your CI/CD pipelines to support all of the changes I just listed. Beyond the amount of research that would require to be able to understand all of these steps all at once, and beyond the infeasibility of teams having to set aside feature work for an extended period of time to do this all-in-one update, the crux of the matter is just that .NET Core is very different from .NET Framework. Much better, but very different. And so if you try to bite off too much at once, you're just kind of asking for instability. And doing this at an enterprise scale, if you work at a company, you probably understand this, that instability is just one of the things you really try to avoid in mature enterprise products. It's not something you want to sign up for. So our alternative was to chunk the migration into incremental and sequential phases. This would make the research burden on my team much more manageable. It would make scheduling the migrations easier for product teams. And the amount of instability would be capped, since each phase would only introduce a fraction of the amount of changes that a full upgrade would. So again, after making this decision that we wanted to go in incremental phases, we again updated our goal. Whereas previously, to empower product teams to do the migration, we switched it to empower product teams to incrementally do the migration. All right, so pausing for a moment, I do want to acknowledge that this decision that we made is not standard. There's very little to none of the literature, the blog posts, the official documentation really recommends or promotes this approach of splitting your .NET Core migration into phases. However, I do want to underscore that this insight from MasterCard, the thought that we could take this massive effort that seemed impossible and split it into what ended up for us being 5 releasable chunks, really is what made this effort tenable and possible for us to do. So yes, it was a great decision for us to have this insight. All right, so I told you that we split it up into phases. Now I want to kind of go through what does a phase look like, these 5 releasable phases. Well, first, we'd start with a manual conversion. Members of my team would pick applications and then set out to manually convert them. For example, in the phase upgrading to the SDK project file format, we would research that new csproj format and just start experimenting with that application csproj. And all the while, each of the changes that we were making, we would keep them in a log of each step that we took. And so next, we would translate that log into a link pad script that could replicate that same manual update. So every step that we did manually, we replaced it with the script. So depending on which phase that we were on, this might have involved using Roslyn to refactor C# code, or perhaps we would update some NuGet packages, or transform our XML or JSON configuration files, or we might just be moving files around. These scripts really, we tried to replicate anything that you could do by hand. Next, we did what we called dog fooding. So we would run the script on application that my team owns. So, i.e., that my team is the application experts of. I know it's a bit of a plot twist. We're both migration experts and application experts of some things. So since we were the ones that had deep knowledge of these applications, we actually felt like we had the confidence that we could monitor the success of the migration. And so we felt comfortable running these automated scripts on our own applications, and we felt like we could verify the behavior on the other side. And if we automated, if we ran the automation script and there was a little bit more left to do manually, we would take that learning and fold it back into the script, improving it and improving it with each application that we were migrating. And so after migrating a handful of our own applications, we released our migrations to what we called our fast track teams. So let me explain. Most of you probably work with some developers who really like using like the nightly build of Firefox or like their favorite IDE, or they'll seek out like the release candidate versions of things like .NET 5. So we found entire product teams like that, people who really like being on the cutting edge. And so they volunteered, and we would then migrate their applications. And then similar to that dog fooding step, when we migrated the applications that my team knew and intimately understood, anything we learned from these fast track migrations, any manual steps left over at the left at the end, we would take those learnings, fold them back into the script, improving it with each application that we converted. And so now by this time, we would probably have deployed all the way to production these changes on 10 to 15 applications. And so we would have enough confidence that we could roll out to the other 150 web applications, let's say. And so we could release and then follow up with any teams that had, follow up with teams to make sure that they are keeping up to date. All right, so this is what a singular phase consists of. It's kind of this increasing release in these concentric circles, building our confidence with each and every stage we released, and making sure that our automations worked for everybody. All right, so if this is what each individual phase looked like, let me briefly discuss what our phases were. So like I said, we ended up with 5 phases. The first was to upgrade all of our third-party NuGet dependencies to .NET Standard compatible versions. The second, updating to the SDK project file format. The third, updating our web framework from ASP.NET MVC or ASP.NET Web API to ASP.NET Core. The fourth, updating internal NuGet packages to target .NET Standard 2.0. And then the fifth and final one, switching our applications to target .NET Core. So by step 5, we had made it. Great, so now I want to spend some time going into each of these phases. I'll be brief, but I'm going to be a little bit more technical, talking about these phases. Specifically on each of them, I'm going to touch what the benefit of releasing this incrementally was, so what a team could expect to get out of doing this update, and then also talk about what work was required to be able to release this, this phased update. So the first step was to update our third-party NuGet packages to .NET Standard compatible versions. This may be easier for other companies. Ended up actually being fairly simple for us because we only had two dependencies that really needed updating: Autofac, which I love, which is our dependency injection and version of control library use, and NUnit, which I also love, which is our unit testing library. The incremental benefit of doing these updates was that we got to use the new features of Autofac and NUnit. It did require actually a surprising amount of work because of our internal NuGet package situation. We have a lot of libraries that build off of either Autofac or NUnit, so we needed to update those internal libraries to be compatible with these new major versions of Autofac and NUnit. We also wrote a script to refactor your C# around the breaking changes that these libraries had. And we also needed to update specifically our test runner to support these new versions. So depending on your situation and how up to date you keep your third-party dependencies, you might be able to completely skip this step. But this is what it looked like for us. Our second phase was updating to the SDK project file format. This, I think, has a couple of other names. You might just know it as the new project file format. But this one was actually really easy to sell to teams because it's a much simpler package management model because everything is just controlled through your package references and your csproj file. And because you don't need to list every file anymore in your csproj, you had way fewer merge conflicts. So teams were very excited about this. The work that was required here is we did have to do quite a bit of research on how to properly set this up for ASP.NET applications. And so it's a lot of trial and error just to make sure that we were getting the same things being deployed and all of our, things that set IIS settings were being properly set in the new, shorter, sleeker project file format. All right, and then we also wrote a migration script that would transform your csproj from one to the other. All right, the third one was gigantic. It was so big. It was updating your applications, your web applications, if you have them, from ASP.NET to ASP.NET Core. This one was also pretty easy to sell, mostly because you didn't have to use configure way to false anymore. People loved that. But you also got the full ASP.NET Core feature set. This one did require a lot of work. Specifically, the team the Road ASP.NET Core took the opportunity to kind of come up with a lot of new and exciting APIs and ways of doing things. So for instance, previously, when you used to return HTTP code, HTTP status code results, like 200, you can now, from your controller, you can just do this.ok, which is great. That's my favorite API, this.ok. But there are all these kind of, some of them larger, some of them kind of small and trivial like that one. These new patterns that we wrote a migration script that would detect if you're using quote unquote the old pattern and shift you to the new ASP.NET Core compatible version. So this ended up being a very long migration script. It just had a lot of cases of switching over between APIs. And similar to that first phase, we needed to release new versions of our internal libraries because we had a number of libraries that built off of, Web API or MVC specific things. Specifically, we previously, would set up per request behavior using an HTTP module, but we needed to switch that into, so that would work in ASP.NET. But for ASP.NET Core, you need to switch it to middleware. So these were the kind of changes that we needed to make to a lot of our internal libraries. And then also ASP.NET Core deploys completely differently than ASP.NET. It is an executable that you kick off rather than a DLL that works through DLL magic. So we needed to change our deployment pipeline to get that support. The fourth phase was updating all of those 300 internal NuGet packages to target .NET Standard. In most cases, this was very simple. Basically a one-line change, because .NET Standard, especially 2.0, is very compatible. But we did actually take this opportunity to multi-target some of our packages, so target both framework and net standard, because this allowed us to drop some legacy APIs without doing a major version bump. So things we didn't really want to support anymore, but still maintaining compatibility for all of our .NET Framework consumers. This was a big thing that we really tried to design into our migration, is that we didn't want to leave anyone behind. If you stopped on a certain phase, or you were some legacy code and you just weren't going to join us for any of the phases, we didn't want to block you out from, even consuming our internal packages. Like if they had a bug fix, or performance, a version with better performance, we didn't want to say, no, you can't update unless, unless you come on this road with us. We wanted to ensure compatibility for any and all applications, regardless of whether they were legacy or had made other decisions. Great. So this, as I alluded to, did require quite a bit of work because we did need to convert all of our libraries to target .NET Standard 2.0. The migration script was super easy. It was basically a dictionary. If you have this library installed, update it to this new version. And you know where that leads us. I told you there were 5 phases. We ended up at .NET Core. So this is updating all of our applications to target .NET Core 3.1. This is the easiest update and gives you the biggest benefits because you get .NET Core performance, you get .NET Core features, and you also get a feeling of accomplishment. And the work required is very small, just some minor deployment changes because you had laid so much of the groundwork in your previous phases. But the actual code changes required here for a consuming team are very, very small, mostly behind the scenes effort. So those are the 5 phases we ended up with. As I alluded to, you may have more, you may have less, depending on where you, depending on kind of what your internal ecosystem looks like. 5 is just what worked for us. All right, so I spent this talk really emphasizing the strengths of our approach. That was strength 1, that splitting the responsibility between migration experts who create a standard solution and application experts who complete the last mile. That was a strength of our approach. Another strength was that we split up the project into manageable phases that could be independently developed and released. And then the third strength, I really think, of our approach was that we designed each of these phases around ensuring quality by releasing it in those series of concentric circles, wider and wider, building confidence with each group that we release to, So we could be sure that by the time we release to all of our applications, and more broadly, that we were putting out a pretty good product. So I've covered those three strengths, but I did want to just dwell for a few moments, our last few moments together, on some of the things that didn't go as well. I'll be candid about these. So the first is that incremental updates are just intrinsically less motivating. If you release in too small of phases, product teams don't really feel like they're getting too much out of each update, and they can just get update fatigue. So our solution to this was bundling in extra features into the phases, to make them more interesting. So we added on extra things that we didn't necessarily need to. And this one I also felt kind of bad about, is that we had this idea that we could get you 95% of the way there. The fact is we just couldn't. Although .NET applications look very similar, if you're innovating, or if you're an older application that uses patterns that have kind of fallen out of favor internally, we could get, the middle of the bell curve to 95% of the way towards a migration. But if you're on either end, sometimes it felt like we were only getting you 15 or 20% there. We did mitigate this once we realized this problem by adding some of these teams that had particular challenges to our fast track teams, so that we could be sure before we did our wide release that we made solutions that worked for them. And then the final one is that the incremental approach is not super supported by tooling. If anyone from Microsoft is listening, feel free to reach out to me. I can provide you with some examples. There's one on the screen. But this did mean that we spent a little bit more time implementing workarounds to maintain the developer experience. So what we really didn't want was to release a phase and then tell people, this is 2 steps forward, but really also 1 step back. And so this was something that we had to work with. Great. So I just want to thank everybody. Thanks for joining me and listening to this story of a massive and messy migration. Like I said, it's been a joy and privilege to work on this for the last 2 years. This has been so much fun. I've learned a bunch and gained a lot of appreciation for all these technologies and just the hard work of the .NET teams at Microsoft. And so I do love to hear from folks. Please don't hesitate to reach out to me if you're thinking of doing a migration of your own and want to ask more specific questions.
That was amazing, Lizzie. That was incredible. I loved hearing about that. I've worked on some migrations before I worked at Microsoft, and now, and you touched on so many things and pulled it all together so well. I loved how you talked about the hybrid shared responsibility. And I loved also, honestly, when you talked about some things that don't go well, I feel like those are things that I communicate with teams at Microsoft that work on documentation, and I will definitely give them some of that feedback. So, I mean, it was just, I'm blown away. Some things, some good questions here. One that came up was talking about third-party components. And you talked about some libraries. Did you run into some components that just were not going to be compatible?
Honestly, there were very, very few. There was some kind of just utility libraries that we just weren't able to bring with us. Maybe, I don't know, things around like file upload or file parsing. And we just honestly had to find a different library that had been more recently maintained. So there were a couple instances, but we were very lucky that we didn't have any like deep dependencies on those.
Okay. I had one other question here. There's working with microservices. So you were talking mostly about kind of separate applications and NuGet packages. Did you deal with services, and did you have to work with managing microservice migration as well?
Yeah. So one thing I kind of wanted to address at the end of that question about just doing new developments so like with microservices, right, you can just spin them up. And so you could just spin up new ones in .NET Core.
Yeah.
But just kind of the reality of the work that we do is that we have a lot of longstanding products that are seeing tons of development every day. And so it felt like, yes, we could just, like our new products, we could spin them up. We just have hundreds of engineers that are working in these other products, and we want them to be able to capture all the goodness of .NET Core and ASP.NET Core. So we briefly considered that, but we just work on existing products more than we spin up new ones sometimes.
Totally makes sense. We've got some other good questions coming in on Twitter, but we're at time, so we'll have to move on to the next one. But thank you very much. That was a really phenomenal presentation.
Thank you.
Thanks, Lizzie.
Yeah, thanks everybody.